Karen painted my wall without asking, so I turned her house into HOA property when Sarah came home to find her fence freshly painted an ugly beige without her permission. She thought it was just another case of nosy neighbor overreach, but when she discovered who was behind it and what they'd been hiding, this HOA president was about to learn that some homeowners bite back harder than expected. What happened next would strip away everything Karen thought she controlled. Sarah Martinez had spent her entire adult life dreaming of the perfect suburban home. After years of cramped apartments and a messy divorce that left her starting over at 35, she finally found her sanctuary in Willowbrook Estates. The corner lot house came with everything she had wished for: mature oak trees that provided natural privacy, a charming white picket fence that reminded her of childhood storybooks, and most importantly, distance from the HOA drama that had plagued her friends in other neighborhoods. As a real estate attorney specializing in property law, Sarah knew the warning signs of toxic homeowner associations. She had seen too many clients destroyed by power-hungry board members who treated community guidelines like personal weapons. That is exactly why she chose Willowbrook Estates after months of careful research. The HOA seemed refreshingly reasonable, low monthly fees of just $75, basic rules focused on safety rather than aesthetics, and a hands-off approach that respected homeowner independence. For 3 blissful years, Sarah lived the suburban dream she had worked so hard to achieve. Weekend mornings were spent in her garden, carefully tending to the roses and vegetables that brought her peace after stressful weeks in court. Summer evenings meant barbecues on her back deck, laughing with neighbors who had become genuine friends rather than suspicious adversaries. The white picket fence became her pride and joy. She spent countless hours restoring its vintage charm, researching the original paint colors, and bringing it back to its 1950s glory. The house represented everything Sarah had built after her world fell apart. Independence meant no longer depending on someone who had betrayed her trust. Stability meant a mortgage in her name alone, decisions that were hers to make. A fresh start meant neighbors who waved from their yards instead of judging her choices. But that carefully constructed tranquility was about to be shattered by someone who believed rules were meant to control others, not herself. Sarah had noticed Karen Thompson around the neighborhood, of course. The tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair seemed to always be walking her small white dog, clipboard in hand, surveying properties with the intensity of a military inspector. Other neighbors mentioned that Karen served as HOA president, but in 3 years, Sarah had never received a single communication from the board. No welcome letter, no annual meeting notices, no rule updates. The silence had been golden, exactly what Sarah wanted from community leadership. What Sarah did not know was that Karen had been watching her house with growing irritation. The white picket fence that Sarah loved so dearly had become an obsession for Karen, who believed it violated an obscure color guideline buried deep in the community covenants. Karen had spent months building her case, taking photos from different angles, measuring fence heights, and researching every possible violation she could pin on the property. The stage was set for a collision between 2 strong-willed women with very different ideas about community living. Sarah valued independence and personal freedom within reasonable community standards. Karen valued control and conformity above all else, using her position to enforce her personal vision of suburban perfection. Neither woman knew that this conflict would expose secrets, destroy reputations, and ultimately change the entire character of Willowbrook Estates forever. But first, Karen would make the fatal mistake of underestimating exactly who she was dealing with. Sarah single quotes as perfect. Saturday morning routine was destroyed the moment she pulled into her driveway after grocery shopping. Her beloved white picket fence, the one she had spent countless weekends lovingly restoring, was now covered in thick, institutional beige paint. The color looked like something from a government building, completely destroying the charming vintage aesthetic she had worked so hard to achieve. Thick, Uneven brush strokes dripped down the wooden boards like ugly tears. Whoever had done this work was either completely inexperienced or simply did not care about quality. Paint had splattered onto her prized rose bushes, staining the mulch and coating several of her garden tools that had been leaning against the fence. The smell of fresh latex paint hung heavy in the morning air, making Sarah feel nauseated as the reality of what had happened sank in. A folded piece of paper was taped prominently to her mailbox, fluttering in the breeze like a surrender flag. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded what appeared to be an official HOA notice printed on cream-colored letterhead. The message was brief but devastating. Fence color violation corrected per HOA guidelines found in Section 12- of Community Covenants. Fine assessed, $300 for non-compliance with community standards. Payment due within 14 days. Karen Thompson, HOA President. Sarah read the notice 3 times, her disbelief growing with each word. She had never received a warning about any fence violation. No one had contacted her about community standards or color requirements. Her fence had been the exact same pristine white for 3 full years without a single complaint from neighbors or the HOA board. How could someone simply decide her property was in violation and take matters into their own hands? The violation notice included no explanation of what specific rule had been broken, no reference to where she could find the mysterious Section 12- and no appeal process. Most shocking of all, someone had hired painters and expected Sarah to pay the bill for work she never requested, never approved, and definitely never wanted. The audacity was breathtaking. Sarah immediately pulled out her phone and called the number listed on the HOA letterhead. Karen Thompson answered on the second ring with a crisp, businesslike tone that suggested she had been expecting this call. Karen Thompson speaking, HOA President. This is Sarah Martinez from Maple Street, Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice calm and professional. I came home today to find my fence painted without my permission. I need an immediate explanation. Karen's response was delivered in the tone of someone speaking to a particularly slow child. Miss Martinez, your fence was in clear violation of community color standards. I took the initiative to have it corrected rather than drag out a lengthy warning process. The work has been completed to proper specifications, and now your property is in compliance, but I was never notified of any violation. Sarah protested. The fence has been white for 3 years. What specific rule does white paint violate? I do not need to provide advance notice when violations are obvious. Karen replied coldly. Community standards exist for a reason. Your fence was an eyesore that affected property values for the entire neighborhood. I handled the situation efficiently and professionally. Sarah felt her attorney instincts kicking in. You cannot hire contractors to modify someone's private property without their consent. This is destruction of property, and I will not be paying for work I never authorized. Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Miss Martinez, I suggest you read your HOA covenants more carefully. As board president, I have broad authority to enforce community standards by any means necessary. Pay the fine within 14 days or face legal action for continued non-compliance. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her ruined fence in stunned silence. In 15 years of practicing real estate law, she had never encountered such blatant abuse of HOA authority. But Karen Thompson had just made a critical error in judgment. She had picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to fight back through the legal system. This was far from over. Karen Thompson's fence attack turned out to be just the opening. Move in what would become a calculated campaign of harassment designed to break Sarah's spirit and establish dominance over the entire neighborhood. Within a single week of the unauthorized paint job, Sarah's mailbox became a daily delivery point for increasingly ridiculous violation notices, each one more petty and vindictive than the last. The first additional citation arrived on Tuesday morning, citing her garden gnomes as inappropriate decorations that detract from community aesthetics. Sarah's 3 small ceramic gnomes had been cheerfully positioned among her flower beds for 2 years, bringing smiles to neighbors and children who walked by. According to Karen's notice, lawn decorations were limited to tasteful seasonal displays and natural landscaping elements only. The fine was $150. Wednesday brought a violation for her mailbox being 2 inches above regulation height, despite the fact that it had been installed by the previous homeowner and approved during her initial property inspection 3 years earlier. Karen had apparently measured every mailbox on the street and decided that Sarah's was the only one requiring correction. Another $150 fine, with a demand that the mailbox be lowered within 10 days or face escalating penalties. By Thursday, Sarah received her most absurd citation yet. Her holiday lights were creating excessive ill. Sarah arrived at the meeting to find the room packed with neighbors, most of whom avoided eye contact and seemed deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Karen had prepared a professional presentation complete with a slideshow of Sarah's alleged violations. Enlarged photos of the garden gnomes filled the projection screen while Karen delivered a lecture about maintaining property values through consistent aesthetic standards. Some people seem to think they are above the rules that govern our community, Karen announced to the captivated audience, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But here in Willowbrook Estates, we maintain standards that protect everyone's investment and quality of life. The slideshow continued with close-up photos of Sarah's mailbox, measurements of her holiday lights, and even pictures of paint chips from her fence taken before the unauthorized repainting. Karen had clearly been planning this public humiliation for weeks, gathering evidence and building a case designed to turn the entire neighborhood against Sarah. As Karen clicked through slide after slide of violations, the crowd murmured agreement and nodded along with her presentation. Most neighbors were too intimidated by Karen's aggressive personality to question her authority or defend Sarah's right to reasonable enjoyment of her own property. The meeting felt less like a community discussion and more like a public trial where the verdict had already been decided. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was not just fighting individual violations or petty fines. She was fighting a tyrant who had successfully turned the entire community into her personal kingdom, where residents lived in fear of arbitrary rules and capricious enforcement. Karen Thompson had created a system of control that went far beyond reasonable community standards. She was running a dictatorship, disguised as suburban governance. But what Karen did not know was that her target was far from helpless, and this public humiliation would soon backfire in ways she never could have imagined. That night, Sarah sat in her home office surrounded by boxes of documents she had not touched since her house purchase 3 years earlier. As any experienced real estate attorney knows, the key to defeating HOA tyranny lies buried in the fine print that most homeowners never bother to read. If Karen wanted to play legal games, Sarah was about to show her what a real legal professional could accomplish with proper research and attention to detail. Sarah started with the original HOA covenant documents, the thick stack of papers that every homeowner receives at closing but rarely examines carefully. Most people focus on the obvious rules about lawn maintenance and noise restrictions, but Sarah was looking for something much more specific: the enforcement procedures and penalty clauses that govern how the HOA board can actually exercise its authority. As she worked through page after page of legal language, Sarah began to smile for the first time in weeks. The HOA covenants were much more restrictive than Karen apparently realized. Every enforcement action required written notice with a 30-day cure period. Fines could only be imposed after a formal hearing process. Most importantly, any modifications to homeowner property required advance written consent from the affected party. Karen had violated every single procedural requirement when she ordered Sarah's fence to be repainted. There had been no written notice, no cure period, no hearing, and definitely no consent. Under the covenant terms, Karen's actions were not just inappropriate. They were completely invalid and potentially criminal. But Sarah's real breakthrough came when she discovered a clause buried deep in Section 15 of the original community documents. The provision was titled Board Member Accountability and Forfeiture and dated back to 1984 when the community was first established. The language was clear and unforgiving. Any board member found to have violated HOA procedures or used community resources for personal benefit shall forfeit their property rights, with said property to be transferred to community ownership for the benefit of all residents. Sarah had never seen such an extreme accountability measure in modern HOA documents. But apparently the original developers had been concerned about preventing exactly the kind of corruption and abuse that Karen was now demonstrating. The clause had probably been forgotten for decades, but it was still legally binding and could be enforced through proper legal channels with growing excitement. Sarah shifted her research to public property records and permit databases. If Karen was going to be held accountable under the forfeiture clause, Sarah needed evidence that the HOA president was violating the same rules she used to terrorize other residents. What she discovered exceeded her wildest expectations. Karen's own property showed a pattern of modifications and improvements that had never received proper HOA approval. County records showed permits for a deck extension completed 18 months ago, a storage shed built last summer, and major landscaping work that had dramatically altered the property's original appearance. None of these projects appeared in HOA meeting minutes or board approval records that Sarah was able to access through public information requests. But the real bombshell came when Sarah cross-referenced HOA financial records with contractor payments listed in Karen's permit applications. The painters who had vandalized Sarah's fence were the same company that had been paid by the HOA to work on Karen's deck project. A landscaping company that received HOA payments for community beautification had actually performed extensive work on Karen's backyard. Even the storage shed had been partially funded through HOA contractor payments that were supposed to cover community maintenance. Karen Thompson was not just a power-hungry bully, she was systematically embezzling community funds to pay for her own home improvements while using her position to harass neighbors who questioned her authority. She had been stealing money from every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates to enhance her own property value, then covering her tracks by creating distractions through aggressive enforcement of petty violations against people like Sarah. Sarah leaned back in her office chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Karen's corruption and the beautiful irony of what she had discovered. The woman who claimed to be protecting community standards was actually the biggest violator of community rules in the entire neighborhood. The tyrant who demanded absolute compliance from others had been breaking rules and stealing money with complete impunity. Karen Thompson had made the fatal mistake of picking a fight with someone who knew exactly how to use the legal system to deliver justice. The HOA president was about to learn that some homeowners fight back with lawyers, lawsuits, and legal weapons that can destroy more than just fence paint. The trap was set, and Karen had no idea what was coming for her. Sarah's single quotes revenge unfolded with the precision and devastating effectiveness that only comes from years of courtroom experience and careful legal preparation. She had spent 2 weeks building an airtight case that would not only stop Karen's harassment but completely destroy the corrupt system that had allowed such abuse to flourish. Unchecked in Willowbrook Estates, the first phase of Sarah's counterattack involved filing a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority, complete with comprehensive financial records that documented Karen's systematic embezzlement of community funds. Sarah had traced every suspicious payment, cross-referenced contractor records, and built a timeline that showed how Karen had been stealing money for over 2 years, while using aggressive enforcement tactics to distract attention from her own criminal behavior. The Complaint included photographic evidence of Karen's unpermitted home modifications, copies of HOA payments to contractors who had worked exclusively on Karen's property, and detailed analysis of how community funds had been diverted for personal use. Sarah made sure every document was properly notarized, every claim was supported by public records, and every accusation could be proven in court. Simultaneously, Sarah filed a second legal action that would prove even more devastating: formal invocation of the Forgotten Covenant Clause that allowed for property forfeiture when board members violated their fiduciary duties. The 1984 provision had never been used, but Sarah's research confirmed it was still legally binding and enforceable through county courts. Sarah timed the service of these legal documents with theatrical precision that would maximize their impact and Karen's public humiliation. She knew that Karen had scheduled another emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening, ostensibly to discuss escalating enforcement actions against Sarah's continued non-compliance with community standards. The community center was packed once again as neighbors gathered to witness what they expected would be Sarah's final public defeat. Karen stood at the front of the room in a crisp navy blazer, projecting the confident authority of someone who believed she had already won this battle. Her presentation materials were neatly organized. Her slideshow was loaded with fresh photos of Sarah's property, and her tone suggested that tonight would end with Sarah's complete surrender. As we discussed in our previous meeting, Karen began with satisfaction evident in her voice. Certain residents continue to show flagrant disregard for the community standards that protect all of our property values. Tonight, we will be voting on escalated enforcement measures that will finally bring this situation to a proper conclusion. That was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She had positioned herself near the back of the room, and she gave a subtle signal toward the main entrance. Right on schedule. Deputy Rodriguez from the county sheriff's office entered the community center with official documents in hand and a serious expression that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Excuse me," the deputy said in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I am looking for Karen Thompson." Karen's confident smile faltered as every head in the room turned to stare at her. "I am Karen Thompson," she replied, her voice already showing signs of strain. "How can I help you, officer?" Deputy Rodriguez approached the front of the room with measured steps, his boots echoing in the complete silence. "Karen Thompson, you are being served with formal notice of HOA covenant enforcement proceedings and potential criminal charges related to embezzlement of community funds," he announced loud enough for every person in attendance to hear clearly. The deputy handed Karen a thick stack of legal documents while the entire room watched in stunned amazement. Karen's hands visibly shook as she accepted the papers, her face draining of color as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. The woman who had spent months terrorizing Sarah with violation notices was now receiving legal papers that would destroy her life. Sarah stood up slowly from her seat at the back of the room, every eye turning toward her as she walked calmly toward the front. The neighbors who had watched her public humiliation in previous meetings now witnessed her complete vindication with the same fascinated attention. "I guess some people really do think they are above the rules," Sarah said, deliberately echoing Karen's own words from weeks of harassment and intimidation. Her voice was calm and professional, but the irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Karen stared at the legal documents with growing horror as she began to understand what Sarah had discovered and how completely her world was about to collapse. The covenant forfeiture clause was clearly highlighted on the first page, along with detailed evidence of her violations and embezzlement. Everything she had worked to build and control was about to be stripped away by the very rules she had used to terrorize others. "This is ridiculous," Karen stammered, but her voice lacked any of its former authority. "These accusations are completely false. I have served this community faithfully for years." Deputy Rodriguez remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, you will have an opportunity to respond to these charges through proper legal channels." For now, I need to inform you that the County Housing Authority will be conducting a full investigation of HOA financial records and property modifications as Karen stood before the assembled neighborhood with legal papers in her trembling hands. Sarah realized that justice was not just being served, it was being delivered with the same public humiliation that Karen had inflicted on others. The tyrant was finally facing accountability, and the entire community was witnessing her complete downfall. The investigation that followed Sarah's legal bombshell moved with the swift efficiency that only comes when prosecutors discover a clear pattern of criminal behavior supported by overwhelming documentary evidence. Within 72 hours of the legal papers being served, county investigators had seized all HOA financial records, frozen community bank accounts, and begun interviewing contractors who had received suspicious payments from Karen's administration. What they discovered exceeded even Sarah's expectations for the scope of Karen's corruption. The initial estimate of $15,000 in embezzled funds quickly grew to over $25,000 as investigators uncovered additional fraudulent transactions dating back nearly 3 years. Karen had been systematically diverting community money to pay for her home improvements while creating fake invoices and contractor agreements to cover her tracks. The unpermitted modifications to Karen's property were valued at over $30,000 by county assessors, including the deck extension, storage shed, and extensive landscaping work that had all been funded partially or completely through stolen HOA money. Karen had essentially forced her neighbors to pay for improvements to her own home while threatening them with fines and violations for minor aesthetic choices. But the financial crimes were only part of the story that emerged during the investigation. Investigators interviewed dozens of Willowbrook Estates residents and discovered that Karen's harassment of Sarah was part of a much larger pattern of abuse that had been terrorizing the community for years. Neighbor after neighbor came forward with stories of bogus fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and intimidation tactics designed to silence anyone who questioned Karen's authority. Mrs. Chen from Oakwood Drive had been fined repeatedly for her vegetable garden, which Karen claimed violated landscaping standards that existed nowhere in the actual community covenants. The Martinez family on Pine Street had been threatened with liens for their children's playground equipment, which Karen deemed unsightly despite similar equipment being allowed in yards of families who supported her administration. Most damaging of all was testimony from former HOA board members who had resigned in frustration after Karen systematically consolidated power and eliminated any oversight of her decision-making. To former board members provided investigators with emails and meeting notes that showed Karen routinely made unilateral decisions about community funds and enforcement actions without consulting other elected officials. The HOA board, finally understanding their legal liability and desperate to distance themselves from Karen's criminal behavior, unanimously voted to immediately invoke the covenant forfeiture clause that Sarah had discovered. Karen's house would be seized by the community and sold at public auction, with all proceeds going to reimburse the HOA funds she had stolen and to establish a legal defense fund for residents who wanted to sue for her years of harassment. Karen's attempts to fight the forfeiture decision only made her situation worse by drawing additional media attention to the case. Local television news picked up the story after Karen held a disastrous press conference where she attempted to portray herself as the victim of a vindictive neighbor's revenge plot. Her lawyer clearly had not prepared her for the aggressive questions from reporters who had reviewed the extensive evidence of her financial crimes and abuse of authority. The resulting news coverage was devastating to Karen's reputation and any remaining community support. Channel 7's investigative report was titled HOA Tyrant Loses Home to Own Rules, and it featured interviews with multiple neighbors who described years of harassment and intimidation. The story quickly went viral on social media, turning Karen into a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA authority and small-time political corruption. Karen was forced to vacate her house within 30 days of the forfeiture ruling, leading to the spectacle of a public yard sale where former victims of her harassment showed up to purchase her belongings at bargain prices. Sarah watched from across the street as Karen sold furniture, decorations, and garden tools to the same neighbors she had spent years terrorizing with violation notices and arbitrary fines. The community that had once cowered in fear of Karen's authority now openly celebrated her downfall and departure. Children who had been afraid to play in their own yards returned to outdoor activities. Homeowners began displaying garden decorations and making property improvements without fear of arbitrary retaliation. The atmosphere in Willowbrook Estates transformed from one of anxious compliance to genuine community spirit. Sarah's fence was professionally repainted to its original white color at the HOA's expense, using high-quality paint and experienced contractors who restored its vintage charm. The association also implemented new transparency rules requiring board approval for all expenditures over $50, mandatory financial audits, and term limits that would prevent any future president from accumulating Karen's level of unchecked authority. The new HOA board, elected after Karen's removal, operated with a level of transparency and fairness that Sarah had never experienced in community governance. Meeting minutes were published online, financial records were available for resident review, and enforcement actions followed clear, procedural guidelines that protected homeowner rights while maintaining reasonable community standards. Property values throughout Willowbrook Estates increased significantly once the uncertainty and conflict surrounding Karen's administration were resolved. Real estate agents began marketing homes in the community as an example of effective HOA governance. Rather than warning potential buyers about association problems, Karen Thompson had destroyed her own life through greed, corruption, and the arrogant belief that rules existed for other people but not for her. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was now facing potential jail time, financial ruin, and the complete loss of everything she had worked to control and possess. As Sarah stood in her beautifully restored garden 6 months later, watching the moving trucks disappear around the corner from Karen's former property, she reflected on the strange and satisfying journey from victim